My name is Claire Donovan. I am 29 years old, born and raised in Charleston, South Carolina, in a family that always believed appearances mattered more than truth. My life has always been defined by symmetry, ironically so. I have a twin sister, Camille. We were identical at birth, but over time our personalities grew in opposite directions. Where I was measured, discreet, and deliberate, she was impulsive, performative, and restless for attention. People used to joke that we were the perfect mirror, but as I stood in my wedding gown, the veil carefully pinned, I realized the mirror had been shattered long before this day. I had met Ethan Harrington 5 years ago at a charity gala. The Harringtons were old money, the type that never needed to raise their voices to exert power. He was charming in a way that felt calculated, but I told myself it was refinement. Our relationship was meticulously curated: vacations in the Hamptons, holiday photos in matching coats, and a proposal in Paris under the Eiffel Tower. Every detail screamed perfection. The engagement had been covered by a local lifestyle magazine. From the outside, we were the couple everyone wanted to be. Inside, I now knew it was all a performance, one I was unknowingly financing with my trust, my love, and my silence. 2 weeks before the wedding, I received an anonymous message from a number I didn't recognize. No greeting, no explanation, just a single attachment. My heart stalled when I opened it. Ethan, unmistakably him, shirtless, sitting on the edge of a hotel bed, with Camille, my twin, wrapped in the same white robe the hotel chain was known for. I could have screamed, confronted, broken everything in sight, but I didn't. I've never been the kind of woman who reacts in heat. I let my emotions settle like sediment in water until the clarity reveals what must be done. And what I saw clearly was that if I handled this correctly, it would be remembered. Not just by them, but by everyone. The night before the wedding, I checked into the bridal suite alone. I ordered champagne, not to celebrate, but to plan. My maid of honor, a lifelong friend who knew how to read the tightness in my jaw, sat across from me as I edited the footage together. It wasn't just the hotel images. I had hired a private investigator, someone discreet, to trace their meetings. I had clips from parking garage cameras, lobby check-ins, and even audio from one of their whispered conversations where Ethan promised her, "Once this wedding is over, she'll be gone." It was all meticulously arranged into a 3-minute video. No commentary, no captions, just their actions in cold, unfiltered reality. The next day, the ceremony began like any other. The church was filled with magnolias and the soft glow of candlelight. The air smelled faintly of gardenia perfume and old wood. The pews were full, his family in tailored navy, mine in muted blush tones. Camille sat near the front, pretending to avoid my gaze. Ethan stood at the altar in his custom black tuxedo, smiling like a man who believed he had already won. When the officiant asked us to exchange vows, I didn't reach for my note cards. Instead, I gave a subtle nod to the audio-visual technician I had paid in cash the night before. The lights dimmed slightly, and a low hum of the projector filled the silence. At first, guests thought it was a sentimental montage, perhaps childhood photos, a romantic recap of our relationship. But within seconds, the truth unraveled on the massive screen above the altar. Gasps tore through the air as the first image appeared: Ethan, half-dressed, and Camille, laughing with her hair spilling over her bare shoulders. The sequence moved to video: a lobby security clip showing them holding hands, another from a parking garage where they kissed like people with nothing to lose. Then the final clip, Ethan's voice, deep and certain, saying, "Once this wedding is over, she'll be gone." I didn't look at Ethan. I didn't need to. The sound of his mother's sharp inhale, the sudden shuffle of feet, and the brittle crack in the silence told me everything I wanted to know. Camille's face went sheet white, her mouth opening and closing without sound, like a fish gasping for water. The footage ended. The room stayed silent. I reached down, lifted the hem of my gown slightly to free my steps, and walked toward the side door of the church. My heels clicked against the marble in an unbroken rhythm. I didn't run. I didn't cry. I didn't explain. As I reached the exit, I felt the cool draft from outside brush against my skin, carrying the scent of rain that had begun to fall. Behind me, the guests were frozen in their seats, the Harrington family humiliated in front of every influential face they knew. And just like that, I was gone, not just from the church but from the life they had scripted for me. In that moment, I knew the performance was over. The real story was about to begin. What they didn't know and what would make the coming months unbearable for both Ethan and Camille was that I had only played my opening move. What happened in that church was not revenge. It was an invitation to the war I intended to win without ever raising my voice. When I stepped out of the side door of the church, the cool Charleston rain felt like it was washing away every trace of the woman I had been when I walked in. The lace hem of my gown gathered specks of dirt and rainwater, but I didn't care. My driver was waiting, an older man I trusted, someone who had been on my payroll for years and didn't ask questions. He opened the door of the car without looking directly at me, as if sensing that what had just happened inside that building was not something to be discussed. I didn't go home. I didn't go to a hotel in town where someone might see me. I had already prepared for this. A week earlier, after receiving the first set of photographs, I had booked a secluded cabin 3 hours away in the Blue Ridge Mountains under a false name. No traceable cards, no location sharing on my phone. My disappearance was deliberate. The moment I left that church, I ceased to exist in the predictable geography of their lives. Inside the car, I removed my veil, folded it neatly, and placed it in the seat beside me. The silence between me and the driver was comfortable, almost ceremonial. As we pulled away, I could imagine the scene unraveling behind me, Ethan scrambling to speak, Camille trying to follow me, Guess muttering, the Harrington patriarch turning red from the public humiliation. But I knew the most important thing: without me there to confront, they would be left with nothing but each other, the guests, and the wreckage. That silence would grow heavier with every second I stayed gone. When we reached the cabin, I locked the door and unplugged every device except one prepaid phone I had bought in cash. I turned my engagement ring over in my hand a few times before placing it in a drawer. I didn't sell it, not yet. It wasn't about money, it was about control, about keeping something they thought I would throw away in anger. That was the point. I wasn't reacting like a wounded bride. I was moving like a strategist. The first night, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the fireplace, replaying the video in my mind. I didn't think about Ethan's betrayal that wound had already cauterized. I thought about Camille, my twin, the one who had spent our entire lives trying to blur the lines between us, who had always chased what I had simply because she couldn't stand to see me have something she didn't. The affair wasn't about love. It was about her proving, once again, that she could take something from me if she wanted it badly enough. That truth was colder than Ethan's infidelity. By morning, I knew the gossip machine back in Charleston would be in full motion. In small, elite towns like ours, news traveled at the speed of blood through a vein. My absence would only feed the frenzy. The guests would tell their versions. Some would claim I had planned it for months. Others would say I'd had a breakdown. Ethan and Camille would have to decide whether to defend themselves or each other, and neither option would save them. I didn't answer the first dozen calls that came to my prepaid phone. They weren't from Ethan, they were from mutual friends, my maid of honor, and even 1 or 2 members of his family. No one had my location, but that didn't stop them from leaving frantic messages. By the second day, the calls started coming from unfamiliar numbers, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the local press tried to reach me. That's when I escalated the silence. I didn't just disappear physically, I disappeared digitally. I logged out of all my social media accounts and, for extra weight, changed my profile pictures to solid black. No posts, no explanations, just a void where my presence used to be. People hate a vacuum. It forces them to fill it with speculation. And speculation, once it grows unchecked, turns into its own weapon. I pictured Ethan pacing in his family's estate, trying to draft a statement that wouldn't incriminate him. I imagined Camille watching the footage of herself on that church screen, knowing it was burned into the memories of every guest. I wanted them both to sit in that uncertainty, to feel the ground shift without knowing if or when I'd make my next move. Disappearing wasn't retreat, it was the creation of a shadow they couldn't stop looking over their shoulders for. On the third day, I received a single text from Ethan's number. "We need to talk, please." I didn't delete it. I didn't reply. Leaving it there, unread in his mind, was more punishing than any argument. He would imagine my silence as rage, heartbreak, or indifference. He wouldn't know that it was calculation. In my isolation, I wasn't idle. I spent hours reviewing the prenuptial agreement we had signed. I still had my copy annotated with notes my lawyer had made, including several clauses that could be exploited given the right circumstances. I also reviewed the joint accounts we had opened in preparation for the marriage. They were still active, and I still had access. The thought of how easily I could constrict his resources was intoxicating, but I didn't rush it. First, I needed the psychological chokehold to tighten. After a week, the messages from Camille came. They weren't apologies, they were attempts at justification. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. We didn't mean to hurt you. You don't understand the full story. I read them in silence, savoring the unintentional confession embedded in every word. She had no idea that disappearing from her life entirely was the most visible move I could make. Every mutual friend she saw would ask, "Have you heard from Claire?" And when she said no, their eyes would linger, wondering what she had done to deserve the silence. In Charleston, absence becomes presence. My vanishing became the story, more than the betrayal itself. People began to romanticize at the image of me walking out of my own wedding, gown trailing, never looking back. That image was worth more than any public statement I could have made. It was the foundation for what would come next, because disappearing wasn't my revenge, it was my opening act. The next move wouldn't just make them uncomfortable, it would begin to strip away the life they thought they could build on my humiliation. And I was ready to start. By the time my second week in the mountains began, the whispers in Charleston had turned into a full-blown storm. I didn't need to be there to feel it. People I trusted, people who owed me loyalty, were quietly feeding me updates and carefully coded messages. Ethan and Camille had been seen together in public twice since the wedding day debacle, both times looking strained and avoiding questions. I knew the tension was closing in on them. That was when it was time to shift from psychological pressure to something far more tangible: money. Ethan had always been careful about projecting stability, both personally and professionally. He came from old money, but he wasn't as liquid as he liked people to believe. His family's wealth was tied up in property, trusts, and long-term investments that couldn't be touched without long processes and the right signatures. The accounts we opened in preparation for our marriage were meant to smooth over that gap: cash on hand for the honeymoon, deposits for the new house we'd been about to close on, payments for vendors, even some liquid assets we'd agreed to share for joint expenses. All of it had my name on it, because at the time, it was meant to be our life together. And that was the loophole. I had deliberately left those accounts untouched during the chaos immediately after the wedding. I wanted Ethan to feel safe enough to assume I wasn't going to interfere, to start making plans again as if he'd gotten away with everything. But while I was gone, I had my attorney, a man who understood both discretion and precision, draft the necessary orders to freeze all accounts where my name appeared. Not just the joint accounts, but also 2 of his business operating accounts that I had been added to during the engagement for transparency. Freezing the accounts wasn't difficult. Banks respond quickly when a joint holder expresses concern about possible fraud or unauthorized withdrawals. I didn't have to accuse Ethan of anything illegal. I simply stated that I wanted all activity halted pending review. Within 24 hours, those accounts were effectively locked, requiring signatures from both of us to move even a cent. The first sign that the freeze had worked came not from Ethan, but from one of my sources. Apparently, a payment for their planned honeymoon in Bora Bora had bounced. It wasn't just a declined card. The travel agency had called his family's estate directly, inquiring why a $38,000 wire transfer had been blocked. I could picture his face, pale and tight-jawed, as he realized that I had just cut off his ability to access money he thought was already his. But it didn't stop there. I also placed holds on several wedding vendor payments that had been scheduled post-ceremony: the photographer, the florist, the caterer. Because the wedding had concluded under highly unusual circumstances, and because I was still a legal party to the contracts, I was able to dispute the charges and have the funds temporarily recalled. This created an avalanche effect. Vendors started calling him directly, demanding explanations and threatening to take him to small claims court. In Charleston's tight-knit network of luxury services, that kind of disruption spreads like wildfire. Camille, too, felt the effects. The boutique she had been eyeing for a joint business venture with a friend had been relying on a cash infusion. Ethan had promised money that had been sitting in one of those frozen accounts. When the deposit failed, word began to circulate among her friends that maybe Ethan's financial situation wasn't as pristine as they'd both led people to believe. In their social world, perception is reality, and once the perception of weakness takes hold, it's almost impossible to shake. The beauty of the financial freeze wasn't just the immediate inconvenience. It was the way it forced them to interact under pressure. With every bill they couldn't pay and every commitment they couldn't fulfill, they would be reminded that my hand was still on the lever. I didn't have to scream. I didn't have to send threats. All I had to do was exist as a legal name on a piece of paper, and their lives slowed to a crawl. Ethan finally broke the silence. One evening, my prepaid phone buzzed with a message that read, "Claire, this has gone too far. We need to settle this like adults." I stared at the screen, noting how he had shifted from please in his earlier message to a veiled demand now. It meant the pressure was working. It meant he was desperate enough to try to reframe himself as the rational one, even though every action leading to this point had been his and Camille's doing. I didn't respond. Instead, I quietly had my attorney send a formal notice to his lawyer, not Ethan, directly stating that any discussions about unfreezing the accounts would require a comprehensive review of all transactions made in the last 90 days. That included anything tied to personal entertainment and private accommodations. We both knew what that meant. The hotel bills, the dinners, the gifts, the paper trail of their affair, now tucked neatly into a demand for documentation. I didn't care if he provided them or not. The request alone would make him sweat, knowing that I could drag those details into any legal or public arena I wanted. And with the accounts frozen, every day that passed meant more obligations going unmet, more questions being asked, and more cracks forming in the facade he and Camille were so desperate to maintain. From my cabin window, I watched a storm roll over the mountains, the kind that turns the horizon into shifting shades of ash and slate. It felt fitting. The financial freeze wasn't about rage. It was about weathering them down, eroding their stability until they realized that this wasn't going to blow over. And as far as I was concerned, I was just getting started. Next, I would turn my attention to something even more corrosive than money: family loyalty. And when I was done, Camille wouldn't just be broke alongside Ethan, she would be standing in the ruins of her own name. Family has always been both my armor and my battlefield. Growing up with Camille as my twin meant we shared everything: birthdays, clothes, even our closest friends. People often assumed that meant we were inseparable, that our bond was unbreakable. What they didn't see was the undercurrent, the competition, the quiet betrayals, the little ways she had always tried to make sure she was one step ahead. I'd spent years pretending not to notice. But now the pretense was gone, and I intended to cut her off from the one network she still believed she controlled: our family. After the financial freeze, I gave it a week before making my next move. That was enough time for the gossip to sink in, for relatives to start speculating about Ethan's sudden money troubles. Camille had always relied on the belief that our parents and extended family would forgive her anything. She was the charming one, the sister who knew how to flatter, to smile, to play the role of golden child. It had worked for years, but charm only holds if people believe in the story you're telling them, and I was about to rewrite that story. I started small. I reached out to Aunt Lydia first. She's the unofficial gatekeeper of family opinion, the one everyone calls for updates when they don't want to ask directly. I invited her to a private brunch at a quiet cafe halfway between Charleston and her home. No drama, no theatrics, just me, a pot of Earl Grey, and a manila folder I placed gently on the table between us. Inside were printouts, emails, hotel receipts, timestamps, and yes, even the anonymous photos I'd received. But I also included something more insidious: a timeline. It showed in painstaking detail how long Ethan and Camille had been seeing each other, with dates that overlapped important family events. As she read, her lips pressed into a thin line. Aunt Lydia was old-fashioned in her values. Family was sacred, and betrayal of family, especially between siblings, was something she considered unforgivable. By the time she closed the folder, I didn't have to say a word. She just looked at me and said, "The others need to see this." That was exactly what I'd hoped for. Next came my uncle, who managed part of the family trust. The one thing Camille valued almost as much as attention was her position in line to inherit from our grandmother's estate. I knew that if Uncle Robert saw the same folder, with a few added notes about Camille's judgment and moral fitness, the wheels would start turning. I didn't have to directly suggest she be cut out. All I had to do was plant the seed that her recklessness could endanger the family's reputation. By the time we finished our conversation, he was already talking about revisiting the conditions of the will. From there, I arranged a small, invitation-only gathering at our parents' summer house. I told them it was to clear the air about the wedding disaster. Everyone came: our parents, a few cousins, Aunt Lydia, Uncle Robert. Ethan and Camille weren't invited. I made sure of that. Over wine and a carefully catered lunch, I laid out the facts. No shouting, no insults, just a calm presentation of the evidence. I even played a short clip, a muted, grainy hotel security video that showed Ethan kissing her in the hallway outside their suite. The room went silent. My father was the first to speak. "This is beyond poor judgment," he said, voice low but edged with anger. My mother, who had always defended Camille's impulsiveness, didn't say anything at all. She just stared at the tablecloth, her fingers twisting the stem of her wine glass. I didn't need their verbal confirmation, their expressions told me everything. Camille's safety net had just been ripped out from under her. I left that day without pushing for any concrete action. The beauty of the family divide was that it worked best when they thought they were coming to the decision themselves. By the time the weekend was over, I knew the damage had been done. Aunt Lydia would talk. Uncle Robert would start making calls about inheritance clauses, and my parents, well, they would keep their distance from Camille for a while, not out of cruelty, but out of the discomfort of knowing exactly what she'd done. It didn't take long for the effects to ripple. Camille tried to visit our parents the following week, only to find the house locked and our mother too busy to have guests. She called Aunt Lydia, who claimed to be traveling and unavailable. The invitations to small family dinners, birthday gatherings, even our cousin's baby shower stopped coming. And because our family's social circle overlapped so heavily with the city's elite, this wasn't just personal isolation, it was social exile. The final twist came when Uncle Robert quietly updated the trust. I didn't need to see the paperwork to know word travels fast in our family when money is involved. Camille had been moved down the line of beneficiaries, her portion held in a conditional clause that essentially froze it unless she met certain standards of conduct. It wasn't a legal disinheritance, but it was a public declaration within the family that her actions had consequences. From my vantage point, still far from Charleston, still unreachable, I watched her scramble. Every call she made, every attempt to spin the story in her favor, fell flat. Because now, it wasn't just me she'd betrayed, it was the family name. And in our world, that's a sin you don't recover from. But I wasn't done. The family divide had stripped her of her allies. Now, it was time to aim at Ethan's most fragile point, his career. The business blow would not just embarrass him, it would dismantle the very foundation of the life he had built. Ethan's entire identity had been built around his career. In our small southern city, status wasn't just about money, it was about reputation, about who people thought you were when you walked into a room. Ethan liked to present himself as the perfect gentleman entrepreneur, the man who ran a prestigious financial consulting firm with an unblemished record. Clients trusted him because they believed in the image he projected: sharp suits, expensive watches, charity events, and a smile that suggested integrity. I knew better. And now, with his social credibility already cracking under the weight of the wedding scandal, I was going to shatter the rest of it. The truth was, I had been aware of certain irregularities in Ethan's business long before the wedding. When you're engaged to someone, you inevitably see the papers they leave lying around, overhear the calls they take on speakerphone late at night, and catch glimpses of documents on their laptop. I never confronted him about them back then, partly because I wasn't sure I wanted to know the full extent of what he was doing, and partly because I knew that if things ever turned against me, I might need those details. It turned out my restraint had been my greatest asset. The first step was to organize the material I'd collected. I had months of subtle notes and screenshots, each one pointing to questionable transactions, under-the-table agreements, and manipulations of client accounts. At first glance, they might seem like minor industry shortcuts, but to anyone with a trained eye or a conscience, they painted a very different picture. I grouped them into categories: false expense reports, hidden fees charged to long-term clients without their knowledge, and most damning of all, the quiet siphoning of funds into side projects Ethan never disclosed. But a pile of evidence meant nothing without the right delivery. If I sent it to the wrong person, he'd spin it as a misunderstanding. If I handed it to the authorities outright, he might find a way to block it before it gained traction. I needed it to come from multiple directions at once, to make it look like his entire professional world had turned on him overnight. So, I started with the clients. Using an anonymous email address, I sent carefully curated packets to 3 of his largest accounts. Each packet contained not just a summary of the irregularities, but copies of documents with identifying metadata intact, proof that these weren't forged or fabricated. I kept the tone polite, professional, even apologetic. You may wish to review these matters directly with Mr. Callahan, as they may impact your ongoing relationship. I knew the moment those emails landed, the trust he had spent years cultivating would start to crumble. Next, I went for the professional associations. Ethan was a member of a regional financial advisory board, an organization obsessed with appearances. I sent them a different version of the evidence, one that highlighted not just the questionable accounting, but the ethical violations that could get him removed. And because reputational damage spreads fastest through official channels, I made sure the package looked like it had also been sent to state regulators. Even if it hadn't yet, the suggestion alone would put them on edge. The final blow in my opening salvo was aimed at the local press. Our city's business journal thrived on stories about rising stars and sudden downfalls. I didn't give them everything, just enough to suggest they might have a scoop, a couple of damning invoices, a few redacted client names, and a polite message that read, "If you're looking into Mr. Ethan Callahan's business dealings, these might be of interest." I knew reporters well enough to understand they'd fill in the rest themselves, and they'd dig deeper than I ever could. The effect was almost immediate. Within a week, whispers were circulating through the downtown offices. Clients began calling him with urgent concerns. One quietly terminated their contract altogether, citing a loss of confidence. His assistant, a woman I'd always suspected knew more than she let on, stopped showing up to work. Then came the email from the Financial Advisory Board, requesting an emergency meeting to address recent allegations. Camille, from what I heard through the family grapevine, was livid. Ethan's unraveling reputation meant fewer social invitations, fewer people willing to be seen with them. She had traded her family's trust for a man who was now losing his own. And the best part? They couldn't even publicly blame me without admitting how I'd gotten the information. The evidence was damning. But it was also the kind of thing only someone close to him could have gathered, meaning any public complaint would just confirm how deep my access to his life had been. By the end of the month, Ethan's business was bleeding clients. His prestigious image had been replaced by the quiet but unmistakable label of unreliable. In our city, that was professional death. And just like that, one of his strongest pillars, his career, was collapsing under its own rot. But while he was busy scrambling to salvage what was left of his livelihood, I was already preparing my next move. The business blow had been about him. Now, it was time to circle back to Camille. The lover's isolation would dismantle the illusion of partnership she had clung to since the day they betrayed me. If Ethan's career was his armor, Camille's belief in their love story was her oxygen. It was the only thing she had left to justify what she'd done to me, betraying her own twin sister for a man who, on paper, seemed like the better prize. She had burned her relationship with half the family, turned herself into the black sheep, and endured the side eye of friends who privately thought she'd gone too far. The only way she could sleep at night was by convincing herself that she and Ethan were some kind of star-crossed pair who had defied the odds. I knew that if I could take that away, I wouldn't just hurt her. I'd leave her gasping in a vacuum she couldn't crawl out of. And I already had the perfect weapon, the truth. Because while Camille had been busy stealing my fiancé, Ethan had been busy stealing someone else's time. The other woman was a name I'd stumbled across while combing through Ethan's business records for the last move. She wasn't just a fling, she was a client. The kind of client who mixed business dinners with late-night texts and confidential weekend retreats. Her name was Sophia Green, and the breadcrumbs were all over Ethan's emails. At first, I thought she might be just another affair from before the wedding. But as I dug deeper, I realized the messages were recent, some sent after the scandal, while Ethan and Camille were supposedly rebuilding their life together. The beauty of this discovery was its double-edged nature. Not only would it destroy Camille's fragile trust in Ethan, but it would also make her realize she wasn't even special. She wasn't the exception, she was just another interchangeable piece in Ethan's collection of conquests. But to pull this off, I couldn't just dump the information on her directly. Camille would either deny it, accuse me of fabricating it, or worse, run to Ethan, giving him time to twist the story. No, the truth needed to come from somewhere else, somewhere she couldn't discredit. And it had to be public enough that she couldn't ignore it. I started by planting seeds. A mutual friend, someone still willing to talk to both of us, received an anonymous tip that Ethan and Sophia have been seen at the Bellamy Hotel on Friday nights. I made sure this friend had just enough curiosity to bring it up casually at brunch with Camille, knowing Camille's jealousy would do the rest. That alone wouldn't be enough to break her, but it would put her in the right headspace, suspicious, on edge, and ready to notice details she might otherwise ignore. The second step was more surgical. I printed copies of a few damning messages, nothing too graphic, just enough to be unmistakably romantic and dated after the wedding fiasco. I slid them into an unmarked envelope and had it delivered to Camille's workplace, ensuring her co-workers would see her receive it. A woman's pride can take a lot, but being blindsided in front of an audience cuts deeper than any private betrayal. Still, the coup de grace had to be undeniable. So, I orchestrated the moment myself. Using a fake profile, I arranged to accidentally be at the same upscale restaurant where Ethan and Sophia had a standing Thursday reservation. The restaurant's maitre d', a sympathetic acquaintance, made sure Camille's name appeared on the guest list for that night through another mutual's coincidental invitation. When she walked in, she would see it for herself, Ethan leaning across the table, hand on Sophia's wrist, that signature half-smirk he used when he was sure he was winning. I didn't need to be there to watch it happen. The fallout reached me anyway, through whispers in family group chats and carefully worded updates from friends. Camille had stormed out before dessert, leaving Ethan to explain himself to an increasingly uncomfortable Sophia. By the weekend, they weren't speaking. And yet, I wasn't done. Silence can be powerful, but in this case, I wanted the story to spread. The same way the wedding video had become the town's favorite piece of gossip, I wanted Ethan cheating on Camille to become the second act everyone talked about at coffee shops and charity events. A few carefully placed screenshots in the inboxes of select busybodies ensured that within days, Camille's humiliation was public knowledge. It wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about dismantling the pedestal she'd put Ethan on. She had traded her family for him, convinced herself she'd won. Now, all she had was the realization that she'd been played. Worse, she had been played in the exact same way she'd helped play me. By the time the dust settled, Camille wasn't showing her face at social gatherings. Mutual friends stopped inviting her, partly out of pity, partly because her presence turned any room icy. Ethan, meanwhile, had burned yet another bridge, this time with a woman who knew enough about his finances to cause trouble if she felt like it. The empire of illusions they'd tried to build together was collapsing faster than either of them could hold it up. And me? I was already preparing the next move, one that would hit Ethan not in his pride, not in his heart, but in his possessions. The asset take-back was coming, and it was going to take more from him than any of my other blows so far. If there's one thing Ethan valued more than his image, it was his assets. He loved possessions not for their use, but for the status they whispered into the right ears: the lakefront condo with glass walls, the imported car he parked just close enough to the curb for everyone to see, the investment property he liked to call our nest egg when we were still engaged. These weren't just things to him, they were trophies, proof that he'd made it. And in his mind, now that the wedding was off, they were untouchable. He assumed the humiliation I had delivered at the altar was my final move. He was wrong. What Ethan didn't remember, or perhaps underestimated, was that the prenup he'd once smugly insisted on had been written with enough legal arrogance to leave him vulnerable. He had made sure to insert clauses protecting his pre-marriage assets, thinking it was a safeguard against me gold digging. But in doing so, he'd allowed my attorney, the same one who had drafted it, to slip in language protecting my contributions and penalizing any fraudulent misrepresentation of assets or intent. And Ethan's entire existence was a fraudulent misrepresentation of intent. I still had the signed drafts, the amendments, the paper trail. More importantly, I had proof that several properties and accounts he considered exclusively his were, in fact, commingled with joint funds, my funds. He had funneled money from accounts we set up for the wedding into maintenance costs for the lakefront condo. He had borrowed from the honeymoon savings to pay off a lien on his vintage Jaguar. These weren't just morally questionable moves, they were legally binding mistakes. My attorney and I mapped it out like a military operation. Step 1. Secure the documentation before Ethan could alter anything. I accessed the cloud storage we'd once shared for wedding planning. He'd forgotten to revoke my access. Every invoice, wire transfer, and bill payment he'd carelessly left in there became ammunition. Step 2. Identify which assets could be reclaimed under the prenup's fraud clause. The list was long enough to make me smile, but the real elegance of this move was in the execution. I didn't want him to see it coming. If he had even a hint, he'd start liquidating or hiding things. So, for weeks, I let him believe I was busy moving on. I even ignored his existence publicly. Meanwhile, my lawyer filed quietly, the kind of filing that doesn't require immediate notification until the court schedules a preliminary hearing. The hearing date was perfect, 2 days before a high-profile networking gala he was co-hosting. I knew the moment he got served, the tension would show, and in his world, showing cracks was deadly. When the papers hit his doorstep, witnesses say he looked like someone had pulled the ground out from under him. Not only was I suing to reclaim partial ownership of the condo, the car, and the nest egg property, but I was also requesting a freeze on the accounts tied to them. That meant legally, he couldn't sell, lease, or leverage them until the matter was resolved. In other words, his trophies were now locked in a glass case he couldn't open. The freeze rippled through his life faster than gossip. The condo's HOA contacted him about overdue fees payments he couldn't make because the joint account was now under court control. The Jaguar sat untouched in his driveway uninsured because the premium payment bounced. And the investment property? The tenant's rent payments were legally redirected to an escrow account under my name pending the outcome. I didn't just take his things, I took his ability to use them. Camille, of course, was collateral damage. She'd been enjoying weekend stays at the condo and the occasional drive in the Jaguar, little luxuries that made her feel like she'd won. Suddenly, those luxuries were off limits. The look on her face captured in a candid photo someone sent me as movers carried her weekend luggage out of the building was almost better than the court's interim ruling. But the best part wasn't the loss itself. It was the publicity. Ethan had worked so hard to project stability after the wedding disaster. The idea that his ex-fiancé was now legally wresting assets out of his hands became a delicious talking point among the same people he needed for his career. His co-host at the gala eventually suggested he step back from the event to avoid drawing the wrong kind of attention. By the end of the month, the court had awarded me control over 2 of the 3 contested assets outright. The lakefront condo, I decided, would be sold not because I needed the money, but because I wanted to make sure Ethan never set foot in it again. The proceeds went into a trust under my name, one I knew he'd hear about through mutual acquaintances. He'd taken my wedding day and tried to turn it into my humiliation. Now, I'd taken the walls around him, the roof over his head on weekends, the machine he polished like a shrine. He was exposed, and he knew it. The next move would be even more visible, not a private legal battle, but a public statement that would leave no doubt about who had truly walked away the victor. And I wouldn't have to say his name once for everyone to know exactly who I was talking about. Silence is often mistaken for weakness. People think that if you're not speaking, you're hiding. They forget that sometimes silence is the sharpest blade, and when you finally choose to wield it, you don't need to swing wildly. One precise cut is enough. By the time the court had ruled in my favor over the assets, Ethan's social mask was cracking. He'd managed to keep his humiliation mostly contained to whispers in the upper circles of our small but viciously connected city. The wedding disaster had been a viral sensation online for a week or 2, but attention spans are short, and he had started convincing people it was an unfortunate misunderstanding, painting himself as the victim of a vindictive ex. He thought if he kept attending the right events and posting curated photos, the narrative would fade. I couldn't allow that. I didn't want to give interviews. I didn't want to post a rant on social media that would make me look like I was still fighting for the last word. I wanted something more enduring, something sophisticated enough that it couldn't be dismissed as emotional retaliation. That's when the idea of the article came to me. It was a contact of mine, a senior editor at the Society Ledger, a high-end magazine known for its investigative profiles and lifestyle features, who unknowingly gave me the perfect opening. Over lunch, she mentioned they were preparing a feature on modern betrayals in high society, looking for personal narratives told from the perspective of those who had experienced them. Her exact words were, "Something layered, strategic. A story that shows not just what happened, but what it revealed about the people involved." I didn't tell her right away that I had the perfect story. I let a week pass, then sent her a carefully crafted pitch under a pseudonym. The pitch outlined the wedding that never was, describing a betrayal between a bride, her groom, and someone in her immediate family. I made no mention of names, cities, or identifying details. But the descriptions were precise enough that anyone in our social sphere, especially those who had been at my wedding, would recognize the timeline, the venue, the roles. My editor friend loved it. She said the anonymity made it even more powerful, more universal. She wanted to run it as a centerpiece for the next issue, accompanied by a stylized photo shoot not of me, but of symbolic imagery, a wedding gown draped over an empty chair, a bouquet floating in water, a pair of champagne flutes shattered on marble. Writing it was an act of both control and catharsis. I avoided melodrama, instead detailing the mechanics of betrayal, how secrets are kept in plain sight, how people choose silence over loyalty when the truth becomes inconvenient. I wrote about the psychology of manipulation, the quiet ways predators groom their victims into accepting small compromises until the ultimate act of disloyalty no longer feels like a leap but a step. And I made sure to include the video. Not literally, the magazine wouldn't publish that, but a vivid description of how, at the moment the vows were expected, a screen came to life with images that could not be explained away. How the bride walked out without a word, leaving an entire room suspended between shock and shame. The genius of the piece was that it never accused anyone directly. It didn't need to. I left little breadcrumbs, subtle references to things only those in the know would understand. The distinct color of the hotel's curtains, the way the groom's cufflink reflected the room's lighting in the leaked footage, the rare champagne vintage served that night. These details made it impossible for Ethan and Camille to publicly deny the story without confirming their involvement. When the issue hit stands, it sold out in less than 48 hours. The Society Ledger had also posted it online, where it was shared in private Facebook groups, whispered about in exclusive clubs, and dissected in group chats. Strangers debated whether the bride had been too cruel or whether her silence had been the most elegant form of revenge. The consensus among the people who mattered, our people, was clear. It was brilliance. The fallout for Ethan and Camille was immediate. He had been planning a pitch to a wealthy investor for a new business venture. The investor, a Ledger subscriber, canceled the meeting without explanation. Camille found herself suddenly excluded from the charity committee she'd been desperate to join. One of the board members told a mutual acquaintance she didn't want that kind of distraction in the group. Ethan tried to pretend he wasn't rattled. He even posted a photo of himself at a restaurant, captioned with some thinly veiled jab about moving on from the past. But the comments were telling, people quoting lines from the article, others posting champagne emojis, some simply writing, "We saw." For me, the sweetest part wasn't the public's reaction. It was knowing that Ethan and Camille were now trapped in a paradox. The more they tried to downplay the story, the more the social circles they depended on treated them like ticking time bombs. The trust they'd worked years to build had been quietly dismantled in a few thousand words. And I wasn't finished. The article was the velvet glove. What came next would be the iron fist. The legal action I had been preparing wasn't about subtlety. It was about drawing blood in a place they couldn't ignore: the courtroom. The next move would be the legal strike. And it wouldn't just cost them their dignity. It would cost them everything they'd tried to keep. If the article was my scalpel, the lawsuit was my hammer. There's a particular satisfaction in taking people who thought they were untouchable and forcing them into a courtroom, under oath, where every lie is a crime and every truth is a weapon. By the time the Society Ledger piece had circulated through every influential channel that mattered, Ethan and Camille's reputations were paper thin. All I had to do now was punch through. This wasn't about revenge for the sake of spectacle anymore. I'd already had that. This was about permanent consequences. Damage they couldn't talk their way out of, couldn't hide behind charming smiles or selective storytelling. And so, 2 days after the magazine hit the shelves, I sat across from my attorney in his glass-walled office, sliding a thick binder toward him. Inside was everything I had: financial records, text messages, hotel receipts, sworn statements from people who'd seen Ethan and Camille together in contexts they had no business being in. But my attorney's grin came when I flipped to the section marked contracts. He knew, as I did, that the prenuptial agreement Ethan had signed reluctantly, at my insistence, wasn't just a formality. It contained clauses that protected me against fraud, infidelity, and reputational harm. By exposing the affair before the wedding had even been completed, I'd set in motion a scenario where Ethan was not only in breach of moral conduct, but also in breach of a legally binding agreement he'd failed to honor even before the ink was dry. And then there was Camille. Family doesn't usually fall under the jurisdiction of prenuptials, but I had another angle for her: defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. When the anonymous photos had arrived on my phone weeks earlier, I'd eventually traced the number back to a burner she'd purchased. I knew why she wanted me to know, to twist the knife, to drive me out before the wedding without ever getting her own hands dirty. That intent was as damning as the act itself. We filed a joint civil suit against both of them: breach of contract against Ethan, defamation and emotional damages against Camille, and a combined claim for the financial impact their actions had caused: lost deposits, lost sponsorships for the wedding, the costs of canceling vendors, and the reputational harm that followed. My attorney calculated the total damages at just over $3.2 million. It was aggressive, yes, that was the point. The day the court summonses were delivered was a quiet masterpiece in timing. Ethan was mid-lunch meeting with a potential investor when a process server walked up to the table, folder in hand, and said his name loud enough for nearby diners to turn. Camille's copy was delivered at the salon where she was having her hair done. I didn't need to be there to see their reactions. Word traveled fast enough in this town. From there, things moved into the discovery phase, which is where my patience and precision really paid off. Every message between them was examined. Every hotel reservation cross-referenced with business trips Ethan claimed to be on. The video from the wedding, my attorney entered it into evidence not for its public shock value, but because it directly supported claims of fraud and reputational harm. Camille's attorney tried to argue that the emotional distress claim was overstated and that she'd simply fallen in love. My attorney didn't even need to raise his voice when he responded: falling in love doesn't require buying a burner phone and anonymously sending explicit photos to your twin sister the night before her wedding. The judge didn't say much, but I caught the flicker in her eyes, the kind of look that said she'd heard enough. The case dragged for months, and that was another part of my strategy. I didn't want a quick settlement. I wanted them to feel the grind, the weight of legal fees stacking up, the embarrassment of being deposed, the dread of seeing my name on every court document that landed on their desks. I wanted them to know that this wasn't a mess they could outlast with silence. By the time we reached mediation, Ethan's once sharp suit jackets were hanging a little looser, and Camille had traded her designer handbags for more modest pieces. The settlement terms were exactly what I'd hoped for. Ethan would pay me $1.5 million in damages, Camille would pay $500,000, and both of them would sign a mutual non-disparagement agreement, which meant they couldn't even try to spin their side of the story without risking another lawsuit. The money was a satisfying victory, but it wasn't the most valuable part. The real win was the precedent it set. Ethan and Camille were now legally bound to silence, their reputations permanently stained in circles that thrived on whispered truths. And every time they tried to rebuild, there would always be someone in the room who remembered the wedding video, the article, and the lawsuit. I didn't attend the final court session when the agreement was signed. I didn't need to. I was already planning my next move, not in a legal arena, but in a social one. Because there was one last act to this story, one final stage where I'd let them see me again, not as the woman they'd humiliated, but as the woman who had taken everything back. By the time spring rolled around, I had been absent from the social scene for nearly a year. Not a trace of me at charity galas, no photos on Instagram from high-profile dinners, no sightings at the events where I had once been a fixture. It was deliberate silence, the kind that lets rumors ferment. People didn't just forget, they speculated. And speculation, when given enough time and the right kind of fuel, grows into legend. Meanwhile, Ethan and Camille had been living in a social purgatory of their own making. On paper, they were still together, but everyone who mattered knew their story. Their invitations to the most exclusive gatherings had slowed to a trickle, and when they did attend, they were often seated at tables in the back, far from the people whose approval they craved. Even in the rare photos that surfaced, they looked smaller somehow, as if the light they used to bask in had been cut off at the source. That source was me. So, when I decided to step back into the spotlight, it wasn't by accident. The stage had been set. The whispers about the lawsuit's outcome had made their rounds. People knew I'd won, but no one had seen me since. That meant my reappearance had to be more than just an entrance, it had to be a statement. The opportunity came in the form of the Ellison Foundation's annual Spring Gala, one of the most prestigious events in the city. Tickets weren't sold, they were bestowed, and being seen there was as much a mark of relevance as being featured in the society ledger. I didn't just get an invitation, I arranged to be on the host committee, ensuring my name would be printed on every program handed to every guest. The night of the gala, I arrived in a midnight blue gown with a back that dipped low enough to make people look twice, but never long enough to be called scandalous. My hair was swept up, my diamond earrings catching the light with every turn of my head. On my arm was someone no one had seen me with before, Alexander Wolf, a venture capitalist with an intimidating portfolio and an even more intimidating Rolodex. The kind of man who didn't just attend events like these, he shaped them. We entered the ballroom as the photographers turned, the flash of cameras almost rhythmic. I could feel the eyes on me, first curious, then recognizing, then whispering. The whispers always came in 3 stages. Is that her? It is her. Oh my God. Look who she's with. It didn't take long before I spotted them. Ethan and Camille were seated halfway across the room, their tables strategically placed so they could see the main entrance, a seat of observation, not influence. Camille's dress was a muted blush that washed her out under the chandelier light, and Ethan's suit, though expensive, looked like it had been worn one too many times without a tailor's touch. When they saw me, their reactions were deliciously different. Camille froze mid-sentence, her lips parting slightly as if she were about to call my name but thought better of it. Ethan's expression shifted faster from recognition to discomfort, to the kind of forced neutrality that only makes the discomfort more obvious. I didn't acknowledge them immediately. That was the power move, letting them see me but making them wait. Alexander and I made our way through the room, pausing to greet people I hadn't spoken to in over a year, each interaction carefully measured. Compliments flowed my way. You look radiant. It's been too long. We've missed you at these events. Every one of those remarks was heard by someone within their radius. When I finally approached their table, it wasn't to speak to them. I stopped to greet the couple seated next to them, donors whose influence in the foundation was rivaled only by their appetite for gossip. I could feel Ethan and Camille's presence like heat on my skin, but I never let my eyes land on them. Instead, I laughed at a well-placed joke, touched Alexander's arm, and excused us with a smile. The silence I left behind was heavier than any confrontation could have been. Later that evening, as Alexander and I took our seats near the front of the ballroom for the keynote presentation, I felt the moment peak. The MC thanked the host committee, reading each name aloud. Mine was among the last, and when it was spoken, the polite applause was punctuated by more than a few glances in my direction. Some of those glances were from people at their table, the kind of glances that said, "She's not just back, she's ahead of us again." After the speeches, as people mingled before dessert, I caught sight of Camille alone at the edge of the room, scanning for Ethan, who had disappeared somewhere. Our eyes met for the first time all night. I held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds, long enough for her to see that I wasn't avoiding her out of fear or hurt. I was simply above her now. Then I turned away, not toward Alexander this time, but toward the event photographer, who was waiting to capture my image against the foundation's logo wall. By the end of the night, I had done exactly what I came to do. I reminded everyone who I was, what I had survived, and how I had risen from it higher than before. Ethan and Camille, meanwhile, left quietly, as if slipping out early could erase the memory of being overshadowed. But the thing about nights like this is that they live far longer than the champagne bubbles. Photos would be in the society pages, my name would be back in conversations, and their absence, their diminished presence, would be noticed just as sharply as my return. The war was over, and I'd won. Not in a blaze of public confrontation, but in the most enduring way possible, by making my life the proof that they had failed to ruin me. And as I left the gala, Alexander's hand at the small of my back, I realized the final irony. They had been watching me all night, but I hadn't once needed to look back.